It's Daniel chapter 6 in the lion's den. Well-known chapter of the Bible. Now, Daniel 6 explains what took place soon after the fall of the Babylonian Empire as the Persians prepare to set up their administration. You'll remember last week we studied how it was that the Persians conquered Babylon, and now they're there trying to set up their government with Belshazzar and Nabonidus. Remember, Belshazzar was a king. He was slain. Nabonidus was also the king. But as I explained last week, you had two kings reigning. Nabonidus was the first king, well, should I say, the king in the first position. He was the father of Belshazzar. Nabonidus said to Belshazzar, "You govern Babylon, and I will go and take care of business elsewhere." So Nabonidus went somewhere else. Belshazzar stayed in Babylon. But when the Persians came in, they killed Belshazzar. They did not kill the father Nabonidus. They took him captive. But both of them are out of the picture now. So with both of them out, it was necessary to appoint a new person to head up the Persian government in Babylon. Cyrus, the ruler of the empire, appointed Darius the Mede to this job. Darius was to rule in Babylon, while Cyrus, his boss, would continue to rule the Persian Empire, of which Babylon was now a part. Remember, we said it was dual kingdom, Medo-Persia, the Medes and the Persians. Darius was on the Mede side, Cyrus on the Persian side. Okay, so with that little background, Darius is setting up his executive staff now. Remember, Cyrus says, Darius, you go ahead, set up the government. But Darius, King Darius, was partial towards Daniel because of his service of excellence and integrity. As a result, Daniel played a prominent role in the establishment of the new government. Unfortunately, it was his prominence that got him into difficulty. Why? We're going to read about it shortly. And this is the 6th chapter of the book of Daniel. So follow with me now as we read. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps, governors, to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them. So you had 120 governors, but you had 3 who were supposed to be in charge of the 120. And one of them was Daniel. Now the satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. He trusted them. Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So here we have the picture. Darius has 120 governors, and Daniel is going to be in charge of all of them. Now, don't forget that Daniel was in the former regime that fell, but he was such an honest person, a person of integrity, that Darius and Cyrus thought that he would not be a threat to the government. So they kept him. And to make him the ruler over all of them, that is phenomenal. So you had Cyrus as the first in command, you had Darius as the second in command, and you had Daniel as the third in command, and then you had all of the other governors under them. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Isn't that a wonderful, wonderful resume? Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever." The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, governors have all agreed that the king should issue a decree, an edict, and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. "Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "The decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Yes, I signed it. It still stands." Then they said to the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. So he was distressed, not upset with Daniel, but he was upset with himself that he signed the law. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. By the way, I should mention here that when you think of a lion's den, sometimes we think of the lion's dens at the zoos, but the dens for the lions back there in those ancient days, it was a big pit in the ground, a hole in the ground. And that is where they placed the lions, and they would look down into the hole and see the lions down there in the pit. So it says here in verse 17, a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lion. They have not hurt me, because I have found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, "May you prosper greatly," he said. "I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel." I thought the law of the Medes and the Persians couldn't be changed, but Darius changed that right here before the 30 days were up. He says, "For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in heaven and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. That is the 6th chapter of the book of Daniel. Now, as was mentioned earlier in the introduction, after the Medo-Persian army took over Babylon, King Darius the Mede recognized the wisdom of Daniel and invited him to be part of the new government. The aging prophet was so good at his public duties that the new king appointed him chief administrator of the whole Medo-Persian government. Now that is just amazing. However, as we read in the chapter, Daniel faced the terrible sin of jealousy on the part of his colleagues. Yet, before the story ended, we saw that Daniel was faithful not only to his secular duties under the Medo-Persians, but most importantly, to his God. Now, Daniel's administrative abilities impressed the king, but provoked the jealousy of other officers. Therefore, they conspired to get rid of him by accusing him of corruption. But as much as they searched, they found no fault in Daniel's administration. They could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. That's verse 4. So they soon realized that in order to frame Daniel, they would have to produce a situation in which Daniel would be faced with a choice of obeying either God's law or the law of the empire. From what the officers learned about Daniel, they were absolutely convinced that under the right conditions, Daniel would side with his God's law and not the law of the empire. What a testimony to Daniel's faithfulness. Darius was taken off guard by a decree that he soon wished he had never signed. He fell into the trap laid by the officers, who were smart enough to use the political circumstances of the recently established kingdom. It is important to realize that the officers lied about the support of the proposal. You remember they claimed that such a proposal had the support of all the governors, all the administrators, the counselors, advisors. However, Daniel was not consulted. This was intentional. And Daniel was the chief administrator, but no one spoke with him about it. He learned about it after the fact. The prospect of being treated as a god may have been appealing to the king, even though it was not the custom for kings to be called gods in those days. For Darius, the decree was an opportunity to strengthen the unity of the kingdom. But for the jealous government officials, it was a tragedy to get rid of Daniel. There is another aspect that is particularly relevant here that needs to be pointed out. Now, what I'm going to be sharing with you is not found in the Bible. It is found in the clay tablets, the history that was written about the situation in Babylon at that time. So let me share with you now what they found on the clay tablets. Nabonidus, remember Nabonidus was Belshazzar's father. Nabonidus, the last Babylonian king, decided to protect the city of Babylon with the help of the gods, the false gods, the wooden gods, the gods of gold, of silver, of brass, etc. This was when the Medo-Persian army was threatening to attack Babylon. Now, Nabonidus, his representatives from the major cities of the empire, took the images of their gods out of the temples of their cities and brought those gods to Babylon. Why? They believed that if the gods were stationed in Babylon, the gods would protect Babylon. Such a delusion that these wooden statues, these golden statues would protect the city, but that's what they did. All of the idols were brought into Babylon. But when the Medo-Persian Empire took over Babylon, they faced a major religious problem. With the images of the gods gathered in the capital city, people throughout the kingdom were having difficulty praying in empty temples. They would go into the temple to pray. There was no God there. Why? The gods had already been taken to Babylon to protect that city. But of course, you know, the city wasn't protected because they couldn't protect the city. The city fell and Belshazzar was killed. So Darius knew he had a problem. All the gods were now in Babylon. Darius decided to correct the situation by sending the gods back to their respective cities and temples. But the process would take a long time. Under such conditions, a decree to not pray to anything but to the king becomes easier to understand today. So that could be one of the reasons why Darius agreed with that decree, because the people, they were getting frustrated in the cities, not having their gods, and he was afraid of a rebellion. And so the decree, don't pray to anything or anyone or any god but to me, Darius, for 30 days. And he was hoping that within that 30-day span, he would get those idols back to the cities so the people could worship them in their temples. Now, regarding the plot to get rid of Daniel, let us remember that the laws of the Medes and the Persians had a reputation of being very strict, unchangeable. This unchangeable nature of the law is mentioned in Esther chapter 1, verse 19. You might have remembered reading it. Here it is. Therefore, if it pleases the king, that's King Xerxes now, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of the Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, cannot be changed, that Vashti, the queen, is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. And also let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. And that is how Esther became queen, as you can remember. So here we have them referencing the laws of the Medes and the Persian again, which cannot be changed. That's why the king found himself in such a predicament. The conspirators soon spotted Daniel praying, and as they brought the accusation before the king, they referred to Daniel in a very demeaning way. That Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, you notice that? Very, very demeaning way. They hated Daniel. They wanted him dead. In their eyes, Daniel, the chief officer of the empire, the king's favorite, is no more than a simple captive. That's all he was in their eyes. In addition, they tried to put Daniel in a bad light with the king by saying that Daniel does not show due regard to you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed. Now the king realized he had been trapped by signing the decree. The text says that the king, Darius, labored till the going down of the sun to try and deliver Daniel. This was dirty politics on the part of his colleagues. Friends, let me pause here to say that corruption, abuse of power, backstabbing, deception, and betrayal can be seen in many governments of the world today. You just have to pick up the newspaper. You just have to watch the television, and you will see that this is true. Nothing has changed in some governments since the time of Darius. Is God's remnant church on all its levels immune from dirty politics? I'm talking about the Seventh-day Adventist Church. No, it is not immune. As long as we are still in this world of sin, we're not in heaven yet. Sadly, church politics can be more subtle and insidious because we can use God to justify our misconduct and use our work for Him to let the end justify the means. This can greatly hinder the mission of the church. I am so thankful that this is not prevalent in every church around the world, every conference, every union, every division. No, but we have pockets throughout the world. And I know firsthand because I've seen it. Maybe it is not evident in Jamaica. It is not there in Jamaica at all, maybe. But just because it's not in Jamaica doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We just have to make sure that we are not part of dirty politics. We have to make sure that we are not participating in any way that would be considered corruption in the church. I'm saying this because we saw this in the government of Darius. This was so blatant, so very blatant. There was nothing that King Darius could do to save Daniel from the prescribed punishment. The irrevocable law of the Medes and Persians must be applied to the letter. We can see here a conflict between two laws, both laws claiming immutability. The law of God, which we know is immutable, and the law of the Medes and Persians, which they claim is immutable, but really is not. Therefore, the king, though reluctant, issued the command to throw Daniel to the lions. But in doing so, Darius expressed some glimmering hope. You remember what he said? Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. There is something else that needs to be spotlighted here in this section. It is the jealousy that occurred. Remember, we read that King Darius was so favorably impressed with Daniel that he appointed him the chief among 3 governors. But unfortunately, excellent qualities do not always lead to commendation. Sometimes it leads to condemnation. Sometimes an excellent spirit in you is the trigger for a bad spirit in someone else. All the excellence that made Daniel stand up stirred up the jealousies of his corrupt colleagues. Daniel did not know for sure that God would save him from the lions, but his clear conscience must have given him some courage to face the situation. He was willing to be devoured by lions rather than compromise his relationship with God. After Daniel was cast into the lion's den, God honored Daniel's faith by sending his angels to protect him. In the morning, it was discovered that Daniel was unharmed and ready to resume his activities in the government. Like Nebuchadnezzar, Darius responded to Daniel's deliverance by praising God. But he did more. He reversed his previous decree. The decree that could not be changed, he reversed it and commanded everyone to reverence the God of Daniel. Yes, Daniel was miraculously saved, his faithfulness rewarded, evil punished, and God's honor was vindicated. What we see here is a mini example, and I need to stress this, friends. That is why we have the books of Daniel and Revelation, and we need to pick up on some of the themes that are written in Daniel and Revelation. What we see here is a mini example of what will happen on a universal scale in the time of the end, when God's people will be delivered, evil will be punished, and the Lord will be vindicated. And we're going to continue to see this next week as we look at chapter 7. There is, however, one disturbing problem, and that is the wives and the children who suffer the same fate as the guilty men. How can we explain what seems to be so unfair? For the women to be thrown in, for the children to be thrown in. First, we should note that the action is decided and implemented by the king according to Persian law, not the law of heaven, Persian law, which includes the family in the punishment of the guilty person, the culprit. God did not command that the wives and the children be killed. God did not command that. According to an ancient principle, the entire family bears responsibility for the offense of a family member. This doesn't mean it's right. It only means that this story fits with what we know about Persian law. We must also note that biblical narrative reports the event, but does not approve of the actions of the king. You follow me? This narrative, this story, this script is just reporting what took place. It does not approve of the action of throwing the women and the children in the den. In fact, the Bible clearly forbids that children be put to death because of the sins of the parents. In Deuteronomy 24:16, it says, "The fathers shall not be put to death for the children, neither shall the children be put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin." What are the lessons we need to learn from this story? Number one, faithfulness. In spite of the decree that required worship to the king only, Daniel continued to pray to his God. He could have shut the windows and prayed in secret. Instead, he decided not to compromise his testimony. Did you notice from chapter 6 that the first thing Daniel did when he learned of his fate was to pray and give God thanks? He immediately approached the throne of grace, the King of Kings. Whatever challenges Daniel faced throughout his life, he was always drawn to put his unshakable trust in God regardless of the consequences. And we've seen this through the first part of the book of Daniel. When we pray, we should do as Daniel did, give thanks. It is best that we not tell God about our problems first. Instead, we should begin by acknowledging God's greatness, his goodness, his faithfulness before we proceed with our needs and our intercessions. Lesson number 2. I have addressed this already, but let me address it again because it is so important. Jealousy, and we saw this in Daniel's colleagues. Jealousy will suck the spiritual oxygen from our lives. You and I will know we have a problem with jealousy if we cannot rejoice in the success of others. Man, when you see your friend being promoted and you are not, how do you take it? How do I take it? Chuck Swindoll, a well-known radio preacher, you might have heard him, you might have read his books. He said, like an angry, half-starved rat prowling in the foul-smelling sewers below street level, so is the person caged within the suffocating atmosphere of selfish jealousy, trapped by resentment, he or she feeds on the filth of his or her own imagination. That's jealousy. Jealousy gives birth to unwarranted suspicion and anger and will breed a destructive, critical spirit. In other words, it will ruin our spiritual appetite. Do you know that jealousy is closely related to pride? Very closely related to pride. And we addressed this subject a few weeks ago. The third lesson, vindication. As a result of Daniel's loyalty to God, the angel of the Lord closed the mouths of the hungry lions. Daniel was protected and vindicated before the king and those who sought to take his life. The experience of that most remarkable Hebrew exile stands as a token of God's ultimate vindication of his people throughout the ages, as they were and are opposed and persecuted by the powers of evil. We shall study more about this starting next week. Daniel's miraculous deliverance, however, does not mean that every faithful servant that is persecuted will be delivered as Daniel was. The thousands of martyrs throughout history show that sometimes God allows his servants to pay the ultimate price for their loyalty without apparent vindication. Vindication for those faithful ones will be when they are taken home to heaven. The relevance of the story of Daniel in the lion's den is for us today as we focus on Peter's warning. Remember what Peter said in 1 Peter 5:8? Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. The person, however, who fixes his or her faith in God can be as safe from Satan's temptations as Daniel was from the lions, because the same God who delivered Daniel still lives, and his love endures forever.